Hello, everyone. I'm going to introduce myself in my Indigenous language first, and then I'll translate for everybody. Halito chemachukma, suhachifo yat alis, chatasia, yakoke chipisa la chique. And so I said, hello, everyone. I hope you all are doing well. My name is Elise, and I am Choctaw. And thank you all for being here and sharing this space with me. And so I am here representing a group of people today. Dr. Daryl Joseph, who is an assistant professor at Northern Arizona University, and Teresa Marza, who is our graduate student at NAU as well. And then the amazing team out at Hopi, the Hopi Opportunity Youth Initiative, Hannah Hunani, Lexi James, and Eugene Cody. And some of my colleagues are here with me today. And I've asked them to just monitor the chat for me if they can. I'm hoping we'll get some questions and comments and have somewhat of an interactive session as best we can on Zoom. And so my research really looks at youth and sport and the importance of seeing sport as a vehicle for empowerment for our Indigenous youth. And it really wasn't till I started working with my colleague and then husband, Daryl Joseph, where we
Carmen, you're in the English channel.
The intersection
No worries.
of our work, looking at the importance of empowering youth, and whether that's a youth experiencing a disability, whether that's a youth wanting to participate in a sport in college. And so our work really surrounds the resilience, empowerment, voice, agency of youth. And so the title of this talk today is Native American Youth, Warriors of Resilience, Promoting Cultural Well-Being. And so our Native youth are warriors of resilience and the future of sustaining and forging strength-based paths for Indigenous communities. So it's our hope today that you will identify concepts of the Nahongvita Model, which Nahongvita means self-empowerment in the Hopi language, to maintain connections to home communities and promote cultural well-being through the eyes of youth who experience disabilities and their path navigating today's world. So when I'm talking today, think about the context of our languages, our ceremonies, our place, and what that means with working with youth who are experiencing disabilities. And I'm getting some chats in here. So, okay, I wanted to make sure everyone can hear me. So on the screen now, you will see what looks like a migration path. The center being home with a capital H, and the outer part being home with a lowercase h. And my husband, Daryl Joseph, who's Hopi from the village of Munkapi, and his colleague, Sweeney Winchief, who is a Assiniboine from Montana, created this model of Nahongvita. And then really the Nahongvita model is representative of a process exemplifying resilience to empower Indigenous youth to utilize their own experiences. And so I'm going to show a short video that Daryl created about 5 years ago, looking at Nahongvita from his perspective. And so I'm going to go back. Sorry, everyone. So I'm going to stop sharing and bring up a video as I navigate this space. Give me 1 second. So this is about a 3-minute clip that Daryl created in 2014.
Nahongvita. In my story, it means how history and community inform resilience to live healthy in the world around me. Like many ceremonial celebrations and events on Hopi, running is endemic to our society. Running has a historical past and is continually a part of Hopi sustenance. Since time immemorial, Hopis ran in the early morning to greet Dawa, asking him to take our prayers for all humanity as he rises, and in return, we will work to reciprocate the blessings we receive. I learned that running was not about self, but about the giving of self for something much larger. Upon this realization, I embraced the holistic and reciprocal energy shared between the people who run for something much larger than themselves. In one particular run, I remember being overwhelmed with the feeling of gratitude to be greeted with blessings from Dawa. The first leg was completed. The mounds of soft sand inviting me to dance intensely challenged my endurance on the second leg. My breathing intensified. Any individual who has struggled to complete what they have started knows that the final stage is the most challenging to one's innermost physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual strength. Looking down at my feet, one foot leading the other, the sand slowly transitioned into pebbles, then into carved rock steps decorating the climb up the mesa's side. Self-doubt began creeping in as I questioned my body's physical ability to match my mental expectations to complete the run. I could have quit, I could have turned around, but I didn't. I didn't because at this very moment of physical and mental sacrifice, I heard the faint cheers of Nahongvita, Aswali, and Kwakwai coming from the children, the aunts, the uncles, the parents, and the grandparents of the community. Upon hearing this, I instantaneously made the spiritual connection to all the teachings over my lifetime about relationships. Relationships to the physical and the metaphysical world. Relationships to the values that develop in the home Buddha. Before I knew it, my community greeted me as I reached the finish atop the mesa. So I ask you, what is your story of Nahongvita? What is Nahongvita in your language? What is Nahongvita for your community?
And so you can see that Daryl talks about running as a source of strength within his community, um, language, culture, history, the empowerment of both men and women, encouraging him to continue on. And so as he asked at the end of that short clip, I want us to think about throughout the presentation, what does Nahongvita mean for you? What is your self-empowerment? What are your community's self-empowerment as an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous person experiencing a disability? So really the general meaning, taking control of your own life, setting goals, making positive choices. It basically means that we have to understand our strengths and weaknesses and believe in ourselves. And I really like to show this story because I think it exemplifies that. To me, for many Indigenous peoples, that stories serve the basis of how our community works, right? We pass ceremony through our stories, we pass history through our languages, and so sharing story with one another is extremely, extremely important. So keep that in mind as we're going through this presentation of Nahongvita. So I wanted to kind of take a step back and talk about both social and Indigenous determinants of health. And so we see on the screen, we have economic stability, neighborhood, physical environment, education, food, community and social context, and health system. And so if we're reading through the list of these, we also see that they're both risk and protective factors within our Indigenous communities and our lifeways. And these risk and protective factors really serve as, how we determine our health throughout our lifetime. And so we see things that are very close to home, such as our neighborhood and our physical environment. And then we also see things that might be not so close to home, a home environment that we go and work in or go and receive an education in. The thing that's missing here that I want to really talk about is that Indigenous determinants of health. And so I think that's a strength that sometimes we in the health profession do not adhere to, do not talk about, and do not validate. That for Indigenous communities, we also have to think about our tribal sovereignty, our nation building, right? Our self-determination. And so important, our languages, our cultures, our histories, and how we navigate these things throughout a lifetime. So it's really important to look at these determinants of health, especially for people and youth who do experience disabilities. The access, ability, inclusivity of economics, of their physical environment, their access to education, access to food. And so these are things that interplay with the experiences of our Indigenous communities and our Indigenous people who are experiencing disabilities. And so now I want us to, just for a minute, take a look at this picture. And we see it's a black and white picture, so it's very old. And I'd like to just get a sense of what you see is happening in this picture, some takeaways of what you think's going on when this picture is, and what it represents. So why don't we just take a minute to look at the picture, and feel free to write in the chat. I love chat box, some interaction. So give me some ideas of how you would interpret this picture. What do you think the story is behind this picture? Okay, I have border schools. What does it represent? White culture trying to take away cultural identities of Indigenous people, uniforms, assimilation, military presence, oppression, control, captive, Hopi men imprisoned at Alcatraz. Thank you, Lee. Trauma, lost warriors, Alcatraz. Yes. Thank you so much, everyone, for your input. So this is a picture of what is captioned Hopi hostiles. And so in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when assimilation was the policy sweeping Indigenous communities, we see that, yes, the implementation of boarding schools to take our youth away from Indigenous communities and teach them how to be, quote, good white Christians. In essence, boarding schools were trying to kill the Indian to save the man. And as assimilationists got to the Hopi reservation, these Hopi men fought back and said, no, you're not taking our children. They resisted against the assimilative efforts. And so they were, in essence, taken to Alcatraz before Alcatraz was a prison. And so by the cavalry. And so before Alcatraz became a prison, it was a fort. And so these 19 Hopi men were imprisoned in Alcatraz for a number of years for resisting assimilative efforts. And so in your discussion box, that was right on. And when I teach in applied Indigenous studies, so I talk to my students about, what do you see in this picture? Colonization, cultural cleansing, sadness in their faces. And so I think we all can, as Indigenous communities, we can relate our own experiences to this trauma that our elders and our ancestors faced to try to ensure our culture, our relationship to land, our relationship to language. And I want to be sure to acknowledge that we can also see something else in this picture. We can see resistance, we can see agency, we can see power of our ancestors and elders speaking up for us. And so again, I think multiple ways we can see this picture, but it's really, to me, a culmination of relationship to land, to sustain and maintain that connection to history, culture, language, and ceremonies. And so another picture here, a more contemporary photo. Similarly, I would like for you to take a look at this picture, and in the chat box, what do you see here? And I think especially look at the young man in this picture. So take a few minutes to look at the picture, and you can comment of what you see in this picture. Future generations, resilience, youth discussing their cultural ways, confidence, advocate, student and disability advocates, two beautiful Native children honoring culture. I agree with that wholeheartedly. His abilities and traditions, youth pride, empowered youth, future leaders, resilience and advocacy. Yes, I love all of those responses. Youth are proud of who they are and probably sharing their story of resilience, youth advocating for disabilities. Yes. So this is a picture in 2016 at the Champions for Change Youth Conference. And so the Champions of Change every year honors Indigenous youth who are advocating for themselves, their communities, and making change in Indigenous communities. And so I wanted us to pay particular attention to the young man. His name is Noah Hotchkiss, and you can see he resides in a wheelchair. And so and if we have time, I'm hoping to show a little clip, but he grew up playing sports, a phenomenal athlete. And unfortunately, when he was quite young, he was in a very bad car accident where his stepmother was killed, and he was injured and now is in a wheelchair. And he talks about how for a while his world was just crushed because he loved sports, and he felt like he could no longer play sports because he could no longer walk. And then his father, who's such an advocate of his, they started talking about, well, what can we do for Indigenous communities, Indigenous youth who do reside in a wheelchair and want to participate in sport? And so he, through funding through the Billy Mills Running Strong for American Indian Youth initiative, he started a basketball program for disabled Indigenous youth and peoples through the Tribal Adaptive Organization. And so he sees now, similarly like he did before, that his sport is a vehicle for empowerment, not only for himself, but his community. And I want to share a quote that he says, and he says, "I'm not seeing barriers I can't get over anymore, but I'm seeing barriers I can overcome," he said. "Now I'm always up for challenges." And I think that's really important because unfortunately, I think when we're looking at barriers for our Indigenous youth, especially barriers for our Indigenous youth that are experiencing disability, we always see what's not there and what's not happening, right? Kind of that deficit approach. And so Noah, yes.
Elise, will you please, speaking of seeing what's there and not there, would you please describe this picture for those who perhaps can't see it?
Yes, thank you, Betty. I'm sorry about that. So we have a picture of two young Indigenous people, a young woman who is in her traditional regalia, sitting next to a young man in a wheelchair. And it seems they're having a discussion amongst one another and discussing, you can tell they're on a panel. So they're talking to a crowd of people about their experiences as Indigenous youth. Thank you, Betty.
Thank you.
And I think another thing that Noah talks about and really represents, and I think it's so important to touch on, is that I feel too often we overlook underrepresented people within underrepresented communities. And so, for example, Indigenous youth who are experiencing disability within Indigenous communities. And it's so important for these youth and people to be able to share their stories, share their agency, share their empowerment with one another. As I said at the beginning, with stories is how we connect as Indigenous communities. It's how we pass down education and empower one another. So with that being said, I want us to think about what are the different ways that disability is understood. And I know that I'm all about today, you know, we've heard stories and examples of how we contextualize disability in many different ways. And I think we all have an inherent thought process based on, you know, the social determinants of health, based on our home communities, of how we interpret disability, right? And so I want us to think about, as I bring up these different spaces in your own thought process, how do you interpret disability within social and community settings? Does it depend on where we are? Are we home in our reservation communities? Are we in Flagstaff? Are we in Phoenix? Are we in Tucson? And then how do we interpret disability in educational settings, right? Within our home communities, do we have access equity? Within college campuses, is there access equity for our Indigenous youth? Academic disciplines, right? Are we talking about studying, working with Indigenous communities surrounding disability and their experiences? Places of employment, right? Are we equitable and inclusive in our places of employment? Do we follow federal guidelines, right? And then other ways. So think about some other ways that disability is understood, and also, in a sense, the dichotomy of disability, right? Because I feel like in the Western context, we're talking about where disability, unfortunately, is seen as a deficit approach, right? Or seen as something other than normal. But then when we think about how about in Native American and Indigenous communities, how do we interpret what a disability is from an Indigenous lens? Because historically within our communities, we have these implicit systems of connectivity where community centricism is how we operate as a community, right? Historically, there had always been a role and place for every member of our community, and the importance of inclusivity. And so if we examine this lens, we see notions of resilience that has been there based on factors of strength. We see the relationship to language, land, ceremony, and really a sense of well-being and cultural ways to interpret disability. So in a sense, we see this dichotomy happening within more of a Western framework in that Indigenous lens of inclusivity. And so it's interesting to think about, has that changed for our Indigenous communities? Have we integrated more of that Western lens? Or has the Western world integrated more of our Indigenous lens? And I think that's the importance of hearing stories and talking to our youth, and hearing their stories of barriers, challenges, but also more importantly, those stories of resilience or overcoming those barriers and challenges. I just want to see if we have any chats about that. Lee, thank you. Many Native Americans do not have a word for disability, correct? Awesome. Keep those chats coming. So I've mentioned these words multiple times before, but we have to think about equity, access, and inclusion in the spaces we engage. And we have to think about this for people who are experiencing a disability, right? The barriers to achieve equity, access, inclusivity in multiple spaces. And we see this at the local level within our tribal communities. We see this at a national level. And then we also see it internationally. You know, we see it K-12 education, higher education. Let's say a person who's in a wheelchair and cannot have an access ramp to the K-12 education, or a person in high school who needs, who's hearing impaired and can read and write and interact just the same as her peers, but cannot demonstrate this because she doesn't have an interpreter, right? So we see that inequity happening within our tribal communities at the national level and internationally. So I want us to think about, what does equity, access, and inclusion mean to you? As an Indigenous person, as a person experiencing a disability, as practitioners, as educators, the whole gamut. We have to think back to the social and Indigenous determinants of health that I talked about and how they shape how we experience equity, access, and inclusion. And we have to think about our elders, and our ancestors and the barriers that they experience. But again, I think most importantly, we have to think about what it means for our Indigenous youth and the paths that they're walking because of this history, right? And also, more importantly, the paths that they're forging. And so I wanted to provide a few concrete examples of, you know, thinking about what we just discussed with equity, access, and inclusion, some barriers that our youth are experiencing internationally and locally within our Indigenous communities. So I'm going to stop sharing quickly again. Oh yeah, and I see my colleagues Lexi and Teresa are here. Hello, ladies. I'm going to share my screen. So this is something Daryl wanted me to share. He was in Australia about 4 years ago on an exchange trip with some of our Native students at Northern Arizona University. And he was watching the TV, and this news story popped up on the news. And this news article says, dreams shattered, Bangladeshi family visa refused due to son's autism. And this news article shows a mother and a father and a young man. And so in essence, these two individuals, the parents, are very prominent medical doctors. And the Australian government didn't refuse to renew their visa because their son had autism. And they said that the funding and the money that would go to his health care was too much, and so that they would have to leave the country. And so we can see as an example of the barriers and challenges that are happening to people of color, but also all people around the country due to people experiencing disability. Another, I want to show the quick video of, sorry, if I can get it, of Noah, because I think it really expresses the importance of his experience.
Because this year is going to fly by. And so have fun, enjoy, and continue to inspire people behind you, even the 8-year-olds coming up behind you. So, and us adults as well, in inspiring us. So let's start with them, right? Start talking about what their initiatives are and how they're changing the world, one community at a time. Let's start with you, Noah.
Okay. Oh,
Tell us about your initiative.
so me and my dad and we started the Tribal Adaptive Organization, and we got a $10,000 grant from Billy Mills and the Running Strong for Native American Indian Youth Dream Starter project to host wheelchair basketball programs on the reservations. And our mission is
Shoot.
And let's talk.
Sorry,
In,
everybody.
prep school, Salisbury Prep. And you had a full
team. Phoenix Suns are the number.
Okay. Well, I do want to talk to you a little bit about how you became disabled. And again, for a lot of people, that is something that they wouldn't want to continue on. They wouldn't want to, or how you adapted to that.
So it was November 22nd, 2009. I just dropped my dad off from the airport, and we were driving to go see my mom. And then all of a sudden, guy fell asleep at the wheel, and we were turning around the car. He hit us head on. My stepmother died in the crash. I broke my wrist, broke my back. I was severe brain injury. So in the hospital, finally realizing that I couldn't use my legs, I couldn't walk. I used to play soccer. I used to play basketball. I was really into sports. And so it really impacted my life and made me feel like I had no value left in this world. Like, do this anymore. Friends, it was always awkward going back to them. But over time, my dad started making me go camping and go rafting, and eventually he made me go skiing for the first time. And so I went up to the Adaptive Sports Association of Durango, and that's really where I started kind of coming out of my shell a little bit and realizing that there are opportunities. Then I started going to wheelchair sports camps where I met other disabled people who started pushing me to go further and further. And then as I look back at it now, like after all those experiences of going to wheelchair sports camps, going to basketball camps, and doing all these things, like as I look at it now, our team, the Phoenix Suns, are the #1 ranked wheelchair basketball team in the country. I'm the fastest under 21 monoskier in the world, and I'm pursuing multiple sports right now to go to the championships in each of them. And so I think through my accident, I've learned a lot about not seeing barriers as barriers that I can't get over. I see them as barriers that I can overcome, and I'm always open for challenges.
And so we can see Noah's experience with his accident, of course, was life-shattering, and it took him a while to realize that he can use his experience to help others. And I've talked to him multiple times, and he's just, like I said, such an amazing young man who's using his experience to empower others. And so I'm going to show one more clip. Sorry. And this clip, so again, my husband, Daryl Joseph, he used to work for the Center for American Indian Resilience, which was a large grant through Northern Arizona University. And he was able to interview and speak with youth who are experiencing disability and record them and their experiences. And so I wanted to show one of those videos. And so just so you know, there's sound in the first few seconds, and then there's not any sound. So you'll have to read the caption.
Most of the school staff, community members, and my parents were told by the schools I attended that I can't read it fast enough. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I'll read it. Throughout all of my school years, I always challenged myself, even when I left the reservation to school. I got tired of being told at every IEP meeting from 6th to 10th grade that I was only at 2nd grade level, and told the IEP team I wanted to go to the Arizona School for the Deaf and the Blind. I graduated from ASCB with good grades, played sports, and loved living in the city among other deaf people. Can you believe that I was accepted to attend Pima Community College in Tucson, Arizona? But again, I was having problems with my classes because I did not have teachers of the hearing impaired at Pima Community College. I told my mother I felt I was dumb and wanted to give up on college, but I got a second chance at college, and now I attend Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. It is hard for a deaf person when you're surrounded by speaking people who do not know sign language. The main reason my mother wanted me to keep me on the reservation was so I would learn my identity, my culture. The biggest problem was not having sign language as part of my life. Every minute, every hour, every year of my life. It is my language and the only way I can learn, just like all of you hearing people who learn by someone talking to you. I know I can't live on the reservation since I can't be independent. I would have to rely on people to take me places and help me. In the city, I can be independent because I also have a visual problem. I have to use a cane at night. I can get around fine by myself in Washington, D.C. and New York. But I would not be able to do that on the reservation. I learned about Gallaudet University when I was in grade school and said I would like to go there for college. It has come true. I have the teachers who know how to teach me since it is the only deaf college in the world. I made very good grades my first semester. I ran for the cross-country team and now on the track team. I am independent in the city, but it is sad that the reservation is not accessible for me. The Hopi Reservation is still a long way from streets, sidewalks, stop signs, trains, subways, buses. Braille interpreters, teachers of the hearing impaired, and not very many people know how to communicate in sign language. Could you live in my world? And so we see the complexity of really both of these youth experiences. And especially for Ivy, let me get back up here real quick. Especially the dynamics about her community as it relates to environment and school, sports, even walking out the door. She expresses she can walk out in the city more readily, and there's readily available resources than on the Hopi reservations. So the limitations she experiences but also, and I think more importantly, her resilience, right? So she really draws the picture of challenges, barriers, and the dichotomy of cultural components, but also the challenges to make these accessible. She asked the question, can you live in my world? And at the beginning of the video, we see her dancing, right? Although she's hearing impaired. And while she's not here to answer the question, I know Daryl would say too that not being able to hear the words might not be as important as feeling the vibrations of the drum on her feet and how she learned to partake in ceremony and culture. I'm gonna just look at the chat to see if there's anything. Yes, she's a very impressive young woman. Yes, a very good digital story telling approach. And I think a component of, again, like I've said, the importance of sharing the stories of our youth and hearing how they've overcome these challenges and barriers. So back to Nahongvita, to be empowered. And so how do we think about the Native Americans who are experiencing disabilities moving toward a more resilient approach in order for them to maintain this strength as they're experiencing these challenges and barriers? And so, as you can see in this model created by Daryl Joseph and Sweetie Winchese, we have home with a capital H home, home with a lowercase home, community, and history. And so we can see with a capital H home is defined as the environment that provides the cultural resources through which youth acquire and develop roles, responsibilities, and these ways of knowing that can contribute to their society. History, just important, is defined as an Indigenous community having roots to this traditional knowledge system and how they experience contemporary political and these economic histories. And then community is, again, the remaining integral part of the Nahongvita model. Community is defined as the role of this broader American Indian community that encompasses both home, capital home, lowercase spaces, and their responsibility for American Indian Indigenous youth. And so as we navigate this space, these spaces, oftentimes each of us has a relationship to home, right? That primary cultural resource. The way we learn early in life, help us make decisions, help us interpret. And then those secondary spaces of lowercase home, which might be going off reservation or to work or obtaining an education. And so in the process, we see challenges and barriers that are experienced for our youth. And so how we overcome them is informed by our history and our community. And so when we think about Ivy, right, we think about Ivy leaving her home community on the Hopi Reservation to a different home community. Whose responsibility is it to help her thrive in these spaces, right? And we talk about it is her home, uppercase home community, the Hopi Reservation, but it's also the home community that's receiving her, right? And then how has Ivy's community and historical context help her? How can that help her bridge these spaces? And this really goes back to what we talked about earlier with social determinants of health. It goes back to our Hopi leaders being in prison, whose resilience is informed by community. And so we see so much happening, right, with our youth who are experiencing disability. And it's not just the experience of disability. We see the experience as living as a youth in today's world, LGBTQ matters, economics, race, ethnicity. So we see all of these different things playing into the experiences of our youth. And I think, again, for our youth to be self-empowered, there has to be an agency that they have and a sense of awareness of concepts that are facilitated by taking action of their own resilience, but also these different communities, home and home, empowering them and helping them along the way. And so to conclude this presentation, you know, when we think about Nahongvita and sustainability, we think about the importance of supporting our cultural well-being. And we have to recall our histories, our home and home communities, the similarities and the differences, and being able to value and respect those similarities and differences in order to build relationships, in order to build that community framework. And I think, you know, it's so important because youth well-being, the well-being of our youth determines the health of our next generation and can help predict future public health challenges in families, communities, and healthcare systems, and agency inclusivity. So these youth are promoting unconditional acceptance through their health, social justice, right? They're being warriors of resilience, and raising this awareness and advocating for themselves and their communities. And so we have so many stories from our Indigenous spaces and our histories that talk about people being warriors of resilience, people overcoming different challenges. Again, in the picture, people being forcibly removed from homelands, overcoming the federal policy that we will one day be extinct, one day we'll all be gone or assimilated or eventually disappear. But after that, we're still here, right? We are still here. And what does this demonstrate? These are stories of our resilience from generations to generations. And again, like I said, our youth now are at the forefront of the experiences. Our youth who are experiencing disability, but also navigating so many spaces, as I talked about before with disability, gender, LGBTQ, social, economic, race, ethnicity, access. All of these intersect and ultimately impact their well-being and culture, and seeing them as a source of strength. And so what are our cultures, again, reflecting back, what do our cultures say about this? How are we healing as communities? How are we healing physically, mentally, spiritually? How are we responding to one another's need for help, need for inclusivity? And I think by bridging all of this, this is where resilience comes from. This is where resilience comes in. And how resilience is translated to inform our families and our communities. And so to end, we know that resilience is overcoming challenges and barriers in a positive way. We can build resilience by structurally examining where barriers exist and actions we take to overcome them. We need to listen to our young warriors and acknowledge their experience. And that is where I will end my talk, but I wanted to provide a few, and I can put this in the chat box, a few resources that are phenomenal. And I wanted to thank our Great Lakes Resource Center, our colleagues up there who provided phenomenal resources for, as it says, Indigenous youth, youth activism, and I'll post these in a second, students with disabilities. And so I'll post those, and I encourage all of us to look through them because they're phenomenal resources no matter what capacity we're working in. And
Elise,
yes.
there were some questions.
Okay, great. I will post these as you.
As I question.
Yes.
Okay. So how do we prevent our young athletes with disabilities from being used as quote unquote disability inspiration porn?
That's a great question. You know, and I like that quote with inspiration porn because my work with athletics, unfortunately, we see a lot of when a person, quote unquote, makes it off the reservation, which I hate that term, to play a sport in college. The story or their documentary is always that, oh, we made it, it's poverty porn, right? We made it out of poverty. We made it out of this third world country. So I appreciate that. I think that we have to, like with Noah's case, I think he would say we have to share our stories, no matter how trivial, how minimal, how hard they are for other people to hear. We have to share our stories if we want to. And he says, and he knows that all students do not feel comfortable sharing those stories. And it took him a long time to be able to do that. And so I think just like with anything else, we have people who are on the front line sharing those stories, but we also have community members who are maybe not on the front line, but just as important, helping those community members express their barriers, their challenges, and their stories of resilience. So I think it's just similar to anything else. And hopefully, it will become more normalized where we see stories of Indigenous youth who experience disability, and it's not something surprising. It's something that we embrace, and just like with athletes, where, gosh, we have a basketball player playing Division I, and it's like our whole world is turned upside down because we can't believe it. So that's a really great point. And I think it's hard, I think it's hard for us to talk about as Indigenous communities and community members, the resources that we are not providing to our youth. But I think it's something we have to talk about. And I think we look at federal Indian policy and the historical injustices over time, and it's in a sense not surprising that we're not able to provide these resources, right? So we have to, as a community, we have to kind of break down those barriers of not wanting to talk about it and begin talking about it to really provide the equitable access and inclusivity of our Indigenous youth. And I'm sorry, for some reason, it's not letting me post in the chat these resources. I'm not sure why.
We can provide the links in the follow-up email. So
okay, that sounds
yeah.
good. And
thank you.
I want you to share this PowerPoint. So if you would like the PowerPoint, you'll be able to click on it there.
Will do.